I would like to talk about various components of the yoga. Some of the components that we earlier talked about, how we can authenticate. Some of the components are we don't see quite incorporated in a typical yoga studio. So some of the components that I will talk about. They all are extremely relevant in facilitating your personal practice of yoga, or even if some of the individuals here in the audience, if they are a yoga teacher, I hope they're already incorporating some of these components that I would talk about. Now, the yoga is like it's the process that driving on 8 different wheels. You may have heard this term, Ashtanga, or the 8 organs. It's not the 8th step. It's 8 organs, or it's like a car is driven on 4 different tires. You can't drive just by putting only one tire. You have to have all 4 of them. Same thing with yoga, as making this yoga practice more powerful and successful, what we're intending to. We want to incorporate all the 8 components of that. Now, the first 2 components of the traditional yoga has yam and niyam. Now, the yam is essentially what you should not do, and niyam is what you should do. Now, I don't want to go into a specific aspect what this the yoga tells, what do's and don'ts. We have plenty of do's and don'ts in our lives from various resources. I would not emphasize too much on these 2 aspects, not because they are not significant, but there is one reason why that if you have done a gardening work, if you want to have a beautiful flower to blossom in your garden, you don't want to. You have to think about the water. You have to think about the land. You have to think about fertilizers. You have to think about proper sunlight. You have to think about all stuff. If you just think about just a beautiful flower, it's not going to come. You have to work really into it. So what I call these 2 limbs, or I don't like to use the word limbs, organs. These 2 organs of yoga are actually the consequence of your practice. So morals and ethics are the consequences of your practice, not the foundation of your practice. These 2 certain morals and ethics are important. You need to know what kind of flowers you want to grow, but the flower should be a blossoming, the consequence of your practice. We don't want a psychological imposition of morals on you and then practice yoga. We want something else. We want yoga practice, and the morals and ethics should be a consequence of that. So these 2 things are very, very important, but I just want to not to talk about in detail on those 2 components, just because everybody has their own specific reservations and specific ideas of what is right and what is not right. And so I don't want to create impositions on you guys that this is what you should be doing, this is what you shouldn't be doing. And you can always, those things are much easier to study on their own. Now, the third organ, I'm saying 3rd and 4th, but they're not, again, they're not a sequential thing. They are like organ system. They all come together. So 3rd component is essentially the component that we see all over asana, which is the posture or the poses. We see that all across in yoga studios. So I want to spend a little bit of time and understanding what poses are. So in a Yoga Sutra, it says that sthira sukham asana means sthir and sukh. Sthir means motionless, okay, and sukha means it's somewhere between happiness and blissful, somewhere in between. Sometimes hard to find exact equivalent in English word of some of the Sanskrit words. So I would always say in between, not to give exact translation. Now, if you are practicing specific asanas or specific poses of yoga, we're not talking about motions only physical, but even mental. We want to have a steadiness, even mentally. Okay, so we want to have some sort of a steadfastness, physically as well as mentally. That's a very important aspect of asana, or the posture, or the poses. And the other aspect is that it should be pleasant. Okay, so if you're practicing yoga and you have all sorts of negative thoughts and negative sensory messages from your different joints in the bodies, maybe you're doing a little too much. Okay, it's not that how many poses or how many numbers of poses you can do in 30 minutes. It's about how many poses you can do with steadfastness and with some sort of a positive emotions to it. The more you do that, so your success of your asana, success of your postures, determined by your mental and physical steadfastness, as well as the pleasant sensory and mental emotions that goes with it. Your success determines on those two things, not on anything else. You don't have to go into a scorpion pose to prove that you are the best yogi in the world. You need to prove that whatever the asana you're doing, you're having a steadfastness of your mind and body, as well as you are having a pleasant experience. Okay, those two things are very, very relevant in the practice of postures and poses. So that's very, the other aspect of the asana is externally, when you look at poses, you're attached to specific poses. Internally, you're attached to a consciousness or attached to so asanas are practiced to maximize your conscious experience with a detachment to sensory and your thought or psychological drama. Okay, so more and more you get yourself away from the sensory experience and the psychological drama that we have from non-stop in our mind. More you stay away from it, that's another measurement of successful yoga or successful yoga practice. So those three components we want to bring in when we practice the yoga. Okay. Now, in terms of the medical standpoint, what is the difference between asanas and or the yoga poses and the exercise? So there are subtle differences. I don't want to go too much in detail of, but I'll go through two or three differences. One difference is that there's two neurological systems in our body. One is the sympathetic nervous system. Well, there's autonomic and the central nervous system. But in autonomic system, there's two systems: sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic system. The sympathetic system is essentially more like a stimulant, creates more exertions, creates more tensions, and parasympathetic is more of a calming aspect of autonomic system. So when our autonomic systems like digestions of our food and various other things, we don't create, unless if you're putting the wrong type of food in our body, then it will create a tension. But otherwise, those processes in our body should occur in a very calm and spontaneous, and you wouldn't even feel those processes happening. You shouldn't be feeling your heart rate is beating. You should be feeling even your breathing in a regular course. Those are autonomic systems that exist in our body. So yoga should activate primarily the calming, the parasympathetic nervous system. If we're looking at medical standpoint or physiological standpoint. The conventional exercises, which is cardio or lifting and various other things, it primarily activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is raising your heart rate, breathing with more effort, and that kind of aspect that goes in, even the building of our muscles. And so very high energy consumption that is occurring in the conventional exercise model. What is in the yoga model, we're looking at more of a parasympathetic system, more calming system. Instead of creating a tension and stress on your tendons and muscles, it creates more of a, think of as a lubricating or more of a relaxing aspect of it, and it becomes more effortless. Now, you can turn yoga into a sympathetic system that we do nowadays, like a power yoga and various other things. And you can make yoga practices look like conventional exercise, where your heart rate's going fast, you're breathing too fast, you're really missing out the major benefits of the yoga by doing those things. Not that I'm a critic of conventional exercise, but if you're doing yoga, you want to do yoga, not exercise. So that's, you want to make those separations. And what are your objectives? Is your objectives to create a tension in your body? Your objectives is to create more exertion, more pain, or various other things in your body, or you want to create more of a positive body. So if whatever objectives you have, you want to act upon. Now, I would not criticize exercise at the level. There are definitely a lot of evidences in the conventional exercise that does improve anxiety and depressions and various other aspects of it. I'm just talking about the physiological difference between yoga and exercise. So sure, don't go home and say, oh, no more exercise. The other aspect difference with that is yoga involves a little more aspect of your inner world. Okay, exercise is primarily focusing on external world. In other words, not only you are dealing with the physical aspect, but you're also improving your mental health, or the sort of aligning or balancing your mind and body. And so that's sort of another difference between those two exercise, or two models of body and mind. There are some other differences that I don't want to go into it, but another very interesting thing, where when you do a conventional exercise, running and things like that, you don't have quite a balance of various muscle groups. Unless if you are doing a swimming is one of the exercises they always recommend, which I don't know how to, but I wish I can swim. But the swimming is a very, very important type of exercise, where it involves every single muscles in a nice, balanced way. Yoga is another type of model that. But there was one orthopedic surgeon from U.S. that was a yoga enthusiast, went to India and learned yoga in more detail. And when he came back, he incorporated his anatomical knowledge into yoga, and he narrowed down that how every single poses were thought in such an intelligent way that every poses involves the stretching of the agonist muscle, or one type of muscle, and the contracting the antagonist, totally opposite of muscle, in such a beautiful way that he didn't have to fabricate that, oh, this is such a balancing way, a balancing model, but he actually went in and characterized every single muscles involved in every single poses, and he kind of demonstrated that how balancing this model is. Every poses has thought through it that you always want to balance two different kinds of muscles. Everything in our body, every muscle that passes through our joints has a agonist and antagonist muscles. So if you activate the agonist muscles, you want to relax the other ones in order to have a more facilitating process. But he was a former orthopedic surgeon, yoga enthusiast, and went in and had a significant contribution in the world of yoga. So So that's another physical balancing aspect of the yoga is very relevant. So that's the difference between some of the conventional exercise model versus the yoga model that we often talk about. There are some other components then in yoga poses that we like to incorporate. One of the component it's called vinyas. Vinyas is essentially a sequence of various poses interlinked in such a way that it facilitates the continuous flow of your yoga exercise, your yoga model. Now, it is very important that it's not that you pick random 20 poses and bring them together and do it in a sequence manner. There's a lot more involved into it. In every poses, whether you do inspiration or expiration, makes a huge difference. Certain poses requires inspiration, certain requires expiration. When you do if you link two different poses in a sequence, make sure that entire sequence covers all the muscles in a balance. So the sequence are just the random things put together. It really requires, say, knowledge of breathing, knowledge of the muscle groups, knowledge of the specific poses, balancing, and also creating a nice flow going from one pose to another pose. So creating a nice connecting. You want to be careful when you transition from one pose to another pose. You don't overspend or underspend the energy. Also, specific areas in your body, you want to lock in the certain prana or certain energies. Where your sight should be, where you should be looking at. So the sequence are not just the random poses, but it requires the immense amount of peripheral information to create a nice continuous flow. And that's essentially called vinyas. One of the most popular sequential flow, as you may have heard, is called sun salutation. That is probably the most popular or the most practiced continuous vinyasa flow that you would see almost any yoga studio you will go. They will definitely incorporate in their yoga class at least once or twice or more the sun salutation. So it is one of the most powerful vinyasa flow that you would ever practice. So that's the aspect of vinyasa. Very, very, very important. You just don't want to do like 20 different poses randomly and there is no correlation with that. You want to do it more in a sequential and a continuous flow. It's more joyful as well as it's more a comprehensive practice. The other aspect of yoga practices is called bandha. Bandha is essentially literally translated as a sort of a gates. Now, there are three levels of locking mechanism, or in English, I think they use locking for bandha. You lock your breath in a certain locations, which empowers the specific muscles, and that's why you're locking in it. I don't know, this might be a very new concept, but I'm pretty sure people who are practicing yoga, they are familiar with this bandha. Very important concept, often not been practiced in any yoga studios, and I don't find any threatening to any science or religion in this aspect, incorporating this. So certainly you should incorporate that in your practice. It's very powerful. There are three primary bandhas. The one starts with the mula, is where your pelvic muscles contracts, and then you have Uddiyana bandha, which is the abdominal muscles, and then you have a Jalandhar bandha, which is more of a locking energies or locking the gates at the more of a neck level, and Mahabandha, which is actually a great lock, which is locks all three of them. Now, locking the energy or the breath in a specific locations in your body is very relevant to facilitate specific muscles that you're using in a specific postures. Okay, so that's another component that often not been incorporated in regular yoga practice. You'd be surprised incorporating some of this very traditional and authentic elements in your practices will facilitate and empower your yoga practice beyond your imagination. Okay, so very important concept. The another concept is called drishti, which is essentially intentional, concentrated gaze to withdraw your other senses from. So we often see this when we go into yoga studios. If you are sort of a new yoga student, you'll be looking around and you will be feeling really bad that you're not as good as others, or you might be looking around just to laugh at others, whatever reasons you're looking around. Very important to have a drishti aspect in your postures to bring in, and which is essentially in a specific poses where your sight should be. And it's not the random, like if you're doing a more forward poses, you're not going to have a sight in this side. You want to have a specific locations where you have to keep your sights. There are 9 different kinds of sights incorporated with a various different kind of poses. It's very important. If you incorporate specific assigned sight to a specific pose, you'll be surprised how effectively you will be able to do that specific pose. Again, this is another facilitator of your yoga practice that you should incorporate. There are many other concepts like a chakra or a kundalini, nadi or mudra, various other aspects of it. And I don't think any of those are any more threatening to anybody's belief. So I would definitely incorporate. I'm not going to go into some of those techniques. They're really easy to understand. So I'll probably skip those ideas. Kundalini is not really easy to understand, but it's a very difficult concept for it's quite not pertinent. It won't really suffice the purpose today. And myself is not an expert in it, so I would rather refrain myself from talking about those things. But Kundalini Yoga, or the chakra aspect, has become one of the very powerful practices in a mainstream, especially in the East and West Coast areas. And it's becoming more and more popular. The other component, yes? Yeah, we can take a break. Yes, where we can stand up, or the most common pose. Yeah. All right. Okay. So I was looking at my handout, and we haven't touched most of the stuff, so we'll go on those things. We already covered the asanas aspect of it, which is essentially what we see in most of the yoga studios, and make sure that we incorporate some of the things that I mentioned. And there are many more other components of the yoga as well, which we can certainly learn from yoga teachers or through the various other resources. Now, the next things that I would like to talk about is called pranayama. Now, pranayama is essentially, so it's a two-word pran. Pran is essentially vital energy or subtle energy. So that every physical form in the existence has a subtler aspect. If you go the physical form subtle and more subtle, essentially you find the energy. If you remember that the famous equations of Einstein, where how energy can convert into the mass. That's essentially every physical form has some energy and a subtler aspect. It transforms into the mass or physical form continuously. The pran is essentially that energy that we're talking about. I think in a Chinese term they use a qi, and then so pran is the energy, and the ayam, the later part of the later half of the word pranayam, is essentially drawing this prana, drawing this energy in a balance, in such a way that we can create a better physical existence that coming out of that energy. A lot of time in Ayurveda practice, which is the ancient Indian medicine, which was another contribution of Patanjali, a compiling effort, contribution. In that fact, they can, those ancient physicians or Ayurvedas, they can feel your subtle energy and they can detect what specific kind of imbalance you have in your energy and what kind of, in which locations in your body it can precipitate in terms of imbalance or disease. So understanding the prana, the subtler aspect of your body is what this pranayam addresses to. This is another component of yoga have not been explored or not been practiced in many yoga studios. Again, this pranayam practice is often associated with breath. A pran is not a breath. Pran is essentially subtle energies of all physical forms of your bodies. The reason we associate it with breath is a very unique physiological system where it works autonomically on its own without even paying attention, controlling, it works. And it can also be changed with intention. If you want to breathing too fast, slow down or hold it, you can do it intentionally at certain up to a certain extent. Okay, you can't hold breath and beyond certain time. Eventually, you have to give up. Body's going to be overpowering you. But it's such a unique system where the autonomic as well as the voluntary nervous system it involves in a breath. So practitioners of pranayam, they realize that breath is one of the physiological system that you can very easily access pran through. Okay, and that's why almost all the pranayam techniques are incorporating the breath. Okay. Now, there are different kinds of pranayam techniques where certain pranayam techniques would have a specific nostril breathing, alternate nostril breathing, rapid breathing, or holding your breath and various other aspects. You trying to access a pran through the manipulating your breath. Now, not only that you are accessing prana, but you are actually drawing the prana out, or you are creating the balance through various breathing techniques. So that's essentially, we often use the term yoga breathing, or the Sanskrit name for that is pranayam, or drawing or balancing your prana. Not so much controlling energy. You can't control the energy. You can just bring more balance to your energy. You can draw more energy to create a better or transform into a better physical system that we carry in our physical body. So that's essentially pranayam. And there are at least 25 to 30 different kinds of techniques. Techniques can be incorporated in your daily yoga practices. If you have a better control of your energy, or I can't avoid this word control, but if you have a better grip or the accessing this prana, you can facilitate your actual yoga practice in a much better way. Even it can be helpful in the asana practices if you have a better access to your prana through a daily practices of. So this is another component we can incorporate to facilitate our yoga practices. Now, Again, I don't want to favor one celebrity, not giving any names, but the name is not a celebrity. It's a very reliable, I think, Dr. Andrew Weil. He teaches a lot of those yoga breathing techniques, and he claims to treat many of the anxiety and depressions and various other mental health challenges through the pranayama. So something you can look into it. There are many other teachers of pranayama if you explore through the YouTube or various other resources. Again, I'm not going to go into all these different techniques, but we can certainly, when we have our own studios or classes, you can certainly ask teachers to teach some of these techniques. That you can do it at home, which can facilitate your performance when you go to yoga studios. Another component is after pranayama, it's called pratyahara, which is essentially withdrawing your senses, your sensory experience of the external world and going more inward. How do you withdraw your senses, or engage your senses? Now, people use various things. You can use a certain pleasant object to engage your visual senses. A lot of time in the studios, you will find a specific type of a smell that you can incorporate to engage some of the pleasant smell and engage that sense as well. Temperature, various manipulations on a temperature can also help, and also where you have to have intentional gaze can also help withdrawing your senses. Now, when I say withdrawing senses, not detaching completely, but withdrawing senses means that your senses are going all over in a different world, then you won't be able to practice your yoga in a more of a concentrated manner. So some of these techniques, subtle techniques, or these subtle elements might have been placed in your studios. You can look around and you may find that may help you to better practice of your yoga.